Hello. So in this chapter, we'll discuss the respiratory system. So the respiratory system is the system which we use for inhaling oxygen. And the whole reason we inhale oxygen is so we can supply oxygen to the cells for the process of cellular respiration. Now, cellular respiration is the process by which energy is generated in the form of ATP, which is adenosine triphosphate. If you remember, we talked about ATP being the energy currency of the cell. So this is the final form in which cells produce and use energy. So for oxidative phosphorylation to occur, oxygen is the final electron acceptor. So this is the whole reason we need oxygen. Now, the respiratory system is the organ through which oxygen is inhaled, and carbon dioxide, which is a waste product generated by the cells as a result of cellular respiration, is exhaled. Now, carbon dioxide and oxygen are inhaled through the respiratory. Carbon dioxide is exhaled and oxygen is inhaled. And this involves movement of muscles to move in and out of the lungs. Now, the circulatory system, on the other hand, transports gases from the lung to the tissues and to various parts of the bodies and vice versa. So, there are several diseases that we know of that affect the respiratory system. For example, pneumonia is an infection you might have heard of, bronchitis, epiglottitis, which is the inflammation of the epiglottis. And then you have inferior turbinate hypertrophy. Now, inferior turbinate hypertrophy is the inflammation of a region in the nasal cavity, upper respiratory tract. This one is close to the sinus. So the inferior turbinate hypertrophy a lot of times is confused with sinusitis. And then you have vocal cord paralysis, which it causes paralysis of the vocal cord, so a person is unable to speak. And then you've heard of diseases like cystic fibrosis, asthma, emphysema, COPD, lung cancer. All of these conditions affect the respiratory system and thereby affect the gas exchange process, which results in difficulties in breathing. So, the respiratory system and urinary system together collaborate to regulate the acid-base balance of the body. So, these two systems compensate any deficits made by each other just so they can maintain the pH of the body. So, if the respiratory system has issues, the urinary system picks up and it compensates for the imbalance in pH. And if the urinary system has defects, the respiratory system works harder to balance the pH of the body. Now, anatomically, the respiratory system can be divided into structural regions and functional regions. Now, structurally, we can divide the respiratory system into the upper and lower respiratory tract. The upper respiratory tract consists of the nose, pharynx, and all the associated structures. So, along with the portions of the respiratory system, there are other associated non-vital functions that the respiratory system performs, and a lot of it are associated with the upper respiratory cavity, like the nerves for sensing odors, structures for production of speech, and in the lower respiratory system, you have the larynx, trachea, bronchi, and lungs, and we use some of these muscles for childbirth or coughing. Now, functionally, respiratory system can be divided into the respiratory zone and the conducting zone. Now, the conducting zone of the respiratory system includes organs that are not involved in gas exchange. For example, nose, pharynx, larynx, trachea, bronchi, bronchioles, and terminal bronchioles. The terminal bronchioles are all the way in here, but the terminal ends where actual gas exchange occurs are called the alveolar sacs and alveoli. And the final branch of bronchiole associated with the alveolar ducts are known as respiratory bronchioles. So this is the only region in the respiratory system where actual gas exchange occurs. So this particular region is called the respiratory zone. So the upper respiratory system include the nose, the pharynx, and everything in this region, like the different parts of the pharynx and the soft palate and the hard pharynx. All of these are a part of the upper respiratory system, and the lower respiratory system is everything below the larynx. So right over here is the larynx. This C-ring-like structure is the trachea, and everything deep within the lungs are a part of the lower respiratory system. So respiratory system is used for respiration, which we often refer to as breathing, and the main functions include gas exchange, so mainly exchange of O2 and CO2 between blood and air. Then you have communication, because all of these organs that are involved in communication, which is present in the respiratory system. And then you have olfaction. So the nerves for olfaction are present in the nasal cavity. That's where we pick up the sense of smell. And then, as we discussed, both the urinary system and respiratory system work together to maintain the acid-base balance of the body. Some other important functions of the respiratory system include regulation of blood pressure. Now, the lungs help in synthesizing a very important hormone known as angiotensin II. Now, angiotensin II is a potent vasoconstrictor. So it helps in increasing blood pressure. So when the blood pressure of the body is low, angiotensin II is produced with the help of certain enzymes in the lungs known as ACE enzymes. So if you've heard of ACE inhibitors are given to people who have really high blood pressure so they can prevent the synthesis of angiotensin II. But our body maintains homeostasis by helping in synthesis of angiotensin II when our blood pressure is low. Now, the other functions of the respiratory system include blood and lymph flow. Now, every time we breathe, it creates a pressure gradient between the thoracic region and the abdominal region that promotes the flow of blood and lymph. Now, lymph itself does not have a pump like the cardiovascular system. So the respiratory system creates a pressure gradient that pushes the lymph for lymphatic circulation. Now, there are certain macrophages in the alveoli of lung that help in removing pathogens. Not only that, but they also help in filtering very small clots from the blood, and they also help in expulsion of abdominal contents. Like breath holding is known as Valsalva maneuver, and it also helps in urination, defecation, and childbirth. Now, Valsalva maneuver is something, just say you're in an airplane and your ears get blocked. You hold your nose and you breathe well, you pinch your nose and you bear down as if you're having a bowel movement, and you push air to open up your ears. So that process is actually called Valsalva maneuver. It helps in balancing air pressure in your ears, and it also causes changes in the heart rate and blood pressure because we hold our nose and we close our mouth and force air. So the respiratory system can be divided into several different regions. Right over here, you see the major parts of the respiratory system. Here is the nose, and this part is the pharynx. The pharynx can be divided into three regions: the nasopharynx, which is present near the nasal cavity. Then you have the oropharynx, which is connected to the oral cavity, and then you have the laryngopharynx. And then you see the trachea, the bronchi, and the lungs. So right over here, you see the external structure of the upper respiratory system. So the major entrance and exit for the respiratory system is through the nose. The external nose consists of the surface and the skeletal structure that are associated with the nose that contribute to all the major functions of the nasal cavity. So the root over here is the region between the eyebrows, and the bridge is the part of the nose that connects the root to the rest of the nose. Now, dorsum nasi is the length of the nose. So this whole region is the dorsum nasi, and the tip of the nose is called the apex, and ala nasi is the cartilaginous structures that form the nares or the nostrils. Nares is plural and nares is singular. And so these are the nostrils, and alar nasi are the cartilaginous structures that form the lateral sides of the nostrils. And then you have the alar nasal sulcus, which is the depression at the ends of the nares and in between the cheeks. And then you have the philtrum. Now, philtrum is the concave region that connects the apex of the nose to the upper lip. So the nares or the nostrils open into the nasal cavity, and the nasal cavity is separated by this region, which is the center, the little soft region, the portion that you can touch with your fingers. So that's the nasal septum. Now the nasal septum separates the left and right sections of the nasal cavity. And inside the nasal cavity, there are three projections known as the concha or the conchae. So you have the nasal concha, the middle nasal concha, and the inferior nasal concha. So the conchae or the conchae serve to increase the surface area, and they help to disturb flow of air as they enter the nose. And this region contains as a conserver of water, and they prevent excessive dehydration of the nose or the epithelium in the nose by trapping a lot of water during exhalation. So the floor of the nasal cavity is composed of the palate, which is connected to the oral cavity as well. The hard palate is a really hard region in your oral cavity, which is also connected to the nasal cavity. So that forms the floor of the nasal cavity. And the soft palate is all the way to the end, which is the muscle tissue. So the air exits the nasal cavity via the internal nares, and it moves up into the pharynx. So this particular region of the nose is the first region to receive the air. So there are several bones that help in formation of the nasal cavity. It also consists a bunch of paranasal sinuses. So all the associated sinuses in here, like the frontal sinus, the sphenoid sinus, the maxillary sinus, and the ethmoid sinus, produce mucus and lighten the weight of the skull. So mucus also helps in trapping the dust and debris. So along with the mucus producing sinuses, the nasal cavity is also lined with the respiratory epithelium, specifically pseudo-stratified ciliated columnar epithelium. So if you remember from the histology lab, ciliated columnar epithelium are long column-shaped cells with cilia, which is a hair-like structure that help in removing mucus, and they also help in trapping dust and debris in the nasal cavity so that clean air can enter the lungs. And these epithelium also consists of goblet cells, which are specialized epithelial cells that actually produce mucus. And then you have capillaries associated right beneath the epithelium, which help in warming the air. And it also contains a bunch of serous and mucus-producing cells that secrete lysozyme. Lysozyme is an enzyme that helps in breaking down substances. And they also contain proteins known as defensin, which have antibacterial properties. So this region of the nose is very, very important in cleaning the air before it enters the lower respiratory tract. The nasal cavity contains cilia to remove dust and debris. It contains erectile tissue of the inferior nasal concha that helps in warming the air due to the underlying blood vessels, and they also help in shifting the flow from one side to the other from time to time to prevent over drying of the nose. And the nasal concha is the region where you have epistaxis or nose bleeding. So you see this in winter when your nose gets too dry due to lack of moisture in the air. So the nosebleed usually occurs in the nasal concha. So here you see the nasal septum, which contains the septal cartilage vomer, which is a bone, and the perpendicular plate right over here. And right under the nasal cavity, the region is known as pharynx. So this region is the pharynx. The pharynx can be divided into three regions: the nasopharynx, which is connected to the nasal cavity, the oropharynx, which is connected to the oral cavity, and the laryngopharynx, which is connected to the larynx. So the nasopharynx is only served as an airway, and an important structure in the nasopharynx is the pharyngeal tonsils. Now, these tonsils are the lymphoid reticular tissue, similar to the lymph node, which are present superior to the nasopharynx. So the pharyngeal tonsils are present right over here, and the main function of this tonsil is not really well understood. However, it does help in presenting dust and debris and pathogens to the immune system. So this region is covered with ciliated epithelium that helps in trapping pathogens and dust and debris that enter during inhalation. So the pharyngeal tonsil, interestingly, are really large in children, but they tend to disappear with age. And right under the structure over here, so the really bulbous structure, teardrop shaped structure, if you ask somebody to open their mouth wide, is the uvula. So uvula is a small bulbous region which hangs down the nasopharynx, and it is also present superior to the oropharynx. So oropharynx is a pathway for both food and air. So in this region, you do not find ciliated epithelium, because if you would have ciliated epithelium over here, that is pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, a lot of food would get trapped in here and your mouth would always smell. So you don't really find ciliated epithelium. Instead, you find a lot of stratified squamous epithelium. Now, the oropharynx contains two sets of tonsil, which is the palatine tonsil and the lingual tonsil. So the palatine tonsils is present in the oropharynx, and the lingual tonsils is literally located at the base of the tongue. Now, because these are tonsils, these are also a part of lymphoid tissue. So the tonsils in the oropharynx help in trapping pathogens to prevent, infection in the body. So the last region is the laryngopharynx. The laryngopharynx is the inferior most part of the pharynx, and it is a route for ingested material until the end. So right at the end of the laryngopharynx, there's a little flap known as the epiglottis. The epiglottis basically is a flap that shuts the airway close when we gulp down food. So it basically makes sure food enters in the food pipe and air enters through the windpipe. So this region again consists of stratified squamous epithelium on the top, and it also does not contain any cilia, just so a lot of dust doesn't get trapped in here. Okay, so the laryngopharynx contains epiglottis, which is the flap which prevents the food from entering into the windpipe. And at the end of the laryngopharynx, we have the esophagus beginning over here. And esophagus is basically the food pipe. And this region does not contain any cilia because we don't want dust and debris to trap in here. So this contains non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. So the next region is the larynx. Larynx is basically the voice box. And the larynx is a cartilaginous structure which is present right below the laryngopharynx. So this region basically connects the pharynx to the trachea. And it also helps in regulating the volume of air that enters and leaves the lungs. So the three large cartilage pieces in this region include thyroid cartilage in the anterior, and then you have the epiglottis, which is present superior. So this is the epiglottis, which is a flap that prevents food from entering into the windpipe. And then you have the laryngeal prominence right over here, which is also called the Adam's apple, which is more prominent in males than in female. Now, right where the trachea begins, you have a cricoid cartilage which forms rings. And this ring basically marks the beginning of the trachea. So the cricoid cartilage that we look at in just a second is the cartilage that divides the larynx and marks the beginning of the trachea. Okay, so epiglottis is the flap that we talked about. It keeps the food from entering the food pipe, and it helps in swallowing. And the tongue pushes down the epiglottis when we swallow, and it shuts close the epiglottis. So if you have ever observed, you cannot gulp and breathe at the same time because it closes the airway when we gulp down food. And the epiglottis consists of a lot of fold, which basically play a big role in keeping the food and drink out of the airway. So if you look at the framework of the larynx, right here is the hyoid bone. Hyoid bone is the bone that you see moving up and down when you gulp food. So the region that you can see moving is the hyoid bone. And this region is the thyroid cartilage, and right here is the laryngeal prominence. So when somebody, well, especially female, if they think they have really big Adam's apple, they sometimes choose to do surgery to reduce the laryngeal prominence. So at this time, they shave off some cartilage from the laryngeal prominence. And if you look at the lateral view, you see the folds that form the vocal cords. And right under the vocal cords, you see the cricoid ligament that mark the beginning of the trachea. So right over here is the cricoid cartilage. So the cricoid cartilage is a cartilage which forms a complete ring structure at the top of the trachea. So the other tracheal cartilages only form C-ring structures, so they are not a complete circle, unlike the cricoid cartilage. So this cartilage over here forms a complete ring around the first ring of the trachea. This picture over here shows the endoscopic view of the respiratory tract. This is the anterior view and this is the posterior region. And the epiglottis is attached to thyroid cartilage, which is a very flexible piece of elastic cartilage that covers the trachea. Now, this region consists of the vocal cords. So you can see the vestibular folds, which is also known as the false vocal cords, is just a pair of folded section of the mucous membranes in this region. And then you have the vocal cord itself, which is actually the true vocal cord. Now, the vocal cord consists of white membranous folds that are attached by the muscle to the thyroid cartilage of the larynx in the outer edges. Now, these folds tend to be larger in males, because of which they have a deeper voice. Now, right over here in the front, you see the trachea. The trachea is basically made of 16 to 20 C-shaped rings of hyaline cartilage. So these are C-shaped rings, and so in the front, they're made of hyaline cartilage, and these C rings are connected in the back with the help of muscles known as trachealis muscles. So the trachealis muscles basically contract or relax to adjust airflow, and it allows some room for expansion when food passes through the esophagus. If you take a closer look at the trachea is lined by ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium. Now, the cilia basically further helps in trapping dust and debris before the air can reach the lungs. So it basically helps clean up the air before we inhale the air. So tracheostomy is the process of making a temporary opening in the trachea for inserting a tube. So they basically make an incision to allow airflow. So this prevents, deficiency of oxygen in the body, and the process is known as asphyxiation. And this can happen due to an airway obstruction in the lungs. This is another picture that shows the anatomy of the lower respiratory tract. So everything below the larynx is the part of the lower respiratory tract. So right over here is the larynx. This is the cricoid cartilage, which is a complete ring that marks the beginning of the trachea, and everything below the cricoid cartilage is C-shaped ring of the trachea. In the front, they have this C-shaped ring made of hyaline cartilage. In the back, they are connected with the trachealis muscle, which contract or relax when needed. If you look at the lower respiratory tract, so this is the main branch where the trachea branches into bronchi to enter the left and the right lungs. So this region where the actual branching occurs is known as the carina. So if you take a look at the cells in the lower respiratory tract, so the trachea consists of cilia, because as air flows through the trachea, it continues to filter the dust and debris with the help of the cilia and with the help of the mucus secreted by the goblet cells of pseudostratified columnar epithelial cells. So the lungs have a base. So the base of the lung is called the base, which is a concave portion that rests on the diaphragm. Diaphragm is the muscle that divides the respiratory, the thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity. And the tip of the lung is called the apex of the lung, and it projects right above the clavicle. And the costal surface is basically the surface which is pressed against the rib cage, and the mediastinal surface is basically the surface that faces medially towards the heart. And the right lung has 3 lobes, and it contains an indentation. Right over here, the right lung is shorter because it is pushed further upward by the liver. The liver sits right over here. The left lung consists of 2 lobes, and it has an indentation because of the heart. The heart is present leaning towards the left lungs, which leaves a cardiac impression or the cardiac notch. So the hilum is basically the slit through which the lung receives the blood vessel and the lymphatic vessels and the nerves. And if you look at the structures inside the lungs, the bronchi is further divided into smaller branches, and all the way to the end you have a cluster of grape-like structure that you call the alveoli. Okay. So if you look at the bronchi, these are the primary bronchi, and you have the secondary bronchi, the tertiary bronchi, and the bronchioles. And if you look at the respiratory zone itself, it consists of the respiratory bronchiole, the alveolar duct, and the alveoli. So these grape-like structures are present at the terminal end of the bronchioles, and they have very large surface area to increase the efficiency of gas exchange, about 750 square feet if you spread them all out. So the gas exchange actually occurs in between the capillaries that you see over here and the alveoli of the lungs. So if you look at the type of epithelium present in the respiratory system, they change as you move further deeper towards the alveolus. So the bronchus consists of pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. The regular bronchiole still consists of ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium. But the terminal respiratory bronchiole and the alveolar duct no longer contain goblet cells that produce mucus, and the types of epithelium slowly transition towards simple squamous epithelium in the alveolus. Now, the alveolus is the actual site of gas exchange, and you do not want really thick cells in here, and that's the reason you only have simple squamous epithelium, because these epithelium are really thin, flat epithelial cells that allow quick exchange of gases. Okay. So the bronchioles itself are 1 millimeter or less in diameter, and the terminal ends are actually the alveolar sacs. The bronchiole itself have the terminal bronchioles have no mucus glands or goblet cells, because the presence of mucus in this region would actually obstruct the airway, and they might reduce the efficiency of gas exchange. So you do not have any mucus membranes over here, and the terminal bronchioles are where you have the alveolar ducts and the respiratory bronchioles. So this over here is the site of gas exchange. So with each division, progressively you find lesser cartilage and more elastic and visceral smooth muscle that allows for elasticity and expansion when we breathe in air. So the deeper regions of the lungs have very little cartilage. So if you look at the terminal ends in the lungs, you see grape-like structure known as the alveolus. Now, the alveolar cells, so the alveolar ducts is which is the site of gas exchange. So these are the respiratory regions of the lungs. Now, the alveoli itself are cup-shaped sacs which allow for gas exchange. So you only have simple squamous epithelial cells over here. So there are two main types of alveolar cells: type 1 alveolar cell and type 2 alveolar cell. And type 1 alveolar cell is where you have 95% of gas exchange occurring. So these are simple squamous epithelial cells. And then you have the alveolar type 2 cells. The type 2 alveolar cells secrete surfactants. So the surfactants basically prevent the alveolus from collapsing. So they help in lowering the surface tension. And the last type of cells that are present in here are the alveolar macrophages. The alveolar macrophages basically help in phagocytosing any dust particles that might be present in this region of the lungs. So the alveoli itself is the actual respiratory membrane, which is the very thin barrier between the alveolar air and blood. So it's mainly made of squamous alveolar cells to allow quick exchange of gases. So the respiratory system itself is covered by a serous membrane, which you call the pleural cavity. So the visceral pleura itself is the membrane that covers the lungs and it's attached to the lungs. The parietal pleura is the layer, the inner surface of the rib cage and the diaphragm. And in between the visceral and parietal pleura, there is a space which contains a slippery fluid that prevents lungs from undergoing frictions with surrounding organs. Now, the pleura and the pleural fluid help in reducing friction, help in creating the pressure gradient to allow gas exchange, and they help in compartmentalizing the lungs and preventing infection from one organ to the other. So right over here, you see the posterior region, so that's the spinal cord. That's the anterior region, so that's the sternum or the breastbone. The heart sits in the mediastinum, in between the two lungs. And this region over here is the parietal pleura. And this red region over here, that's directly in contact with the lungs, is the visceral pleura. So in between the two pleura, the blue space represents the pleural cavity, which contains slippery fluid. So diaphragm, as we discussed earlier, is the muscle that separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity. So when we breathe in air, the diaphragm contracts and flattens, and it allows more room for air inside the lungs. And when we relax or breathe out, it allows the diaphragm to expand and bulge upward again, and it helps in expelling air out of the lungs. So this is what the diaphragm looks like when it's relaxed and when we breathe in air. So when you inhale, the diaphragm muscles contract and flatten to allow more room for air inside the lungs.